Right now, just miles off the coast of China's most sensitive military installation, I mean, the massive naval base at Sanya on Hainan Island, Indian naval ships possess the unprecedented operational ability to dock, refuel, and resupply.
Which is just incredible.
Right. And they can do this not at an Indian base, but at the Vietnamese court of Nha Trang. I want you to just think about the geography of that for a second.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
How did two nations, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, quietly engineer one of the most critical, complex, and honestly high-stakes military alliances in the entire Indo-Pacific?
Well, it's a fascinating reality. What we're seeing right now in 2025 is the culmination of decades of very quiet, very deliberate statecraft.
Yeah.
We're essentially watching a masterclass in how a rising power like India and a fiercely independent middle power like Vietnam structurally align their economies, their militaries, and their grand strategies to, well, survive in a neighborhood dominated by a superpower.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to this elite strategic briefing. We are taking a deep dive into the India-Vietnam strategic relationship.
Absolutely.
We're going to strip away the diplomatic jargon and look at the actual mechanics of this alliance. The weapons deals, the billions of dollars in trade, the historical grudges, and the geographical chessboard of the South China Sea.
It's all connected.
It is. Now, this session is a comprehensive masterclass. It's designed for serious conceptual clarity, rapid revision, and exam-level recall under pressure. We are extracting the key facts, dates, treaties, and frameworks.
Right.
And just a quick, strict rule reminder before we jump in. As we visualize this layered geopolitical map of the Indo-Pacific region, specifically that maritime corridor connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, any maps we discuss regarding borders, territory, Kashmir, Arunachal Pradesh, or Ladakh will strictly always adhere to India's official map representation.
Of course. That's a crucial baseline.
Always. So let's start at the bedrock. To understand how an Indian warship gets access to a Vietnamese port today, we have to look backward, because these two didn't just meet on a geopolitical dating app yesterday.
No, not at all. The institutional trust here is incredibly deep-seated. You have to go back to the post-colonial era to truly grasp it.
Okay.
The historical foundation of this relationship was really forged in the crucible of the Cold War. Specifically, India stood by Vietnam in opposing U.S. intervention in that country.
Wait, and that wasn't exactly a popular or, easy stance for New Delhi to take at the time, was it?
No, it was incredibly risky. I mean, India maintained strict neutrality regarding the internal politics of the Vietnam War itself,
Right.
but structurally, it explicitly opposed the foreign intervention.
Right.
And it's crucial for your exam recall to understand that India took this diplomatic stance even at the absolute cost of embittering its own relationship with the United States. When you're a developing nation and you deliberately antagonize a superpower to stand by a regional partner on principle, that creates a generational memory. The Vietnamese leadership did not forget that solidarity.
It built a baseline of trust.
Exactly, a baseline that survives to this day.
Okay, so that's the Cold War emotional and historical anchor. But let's fast forward a bit to the early 1990s, because the world order effectively collapses and India has to scramble.
Yeah, the end of the Cold War.
Right. This is when we see the initiation of India's famous Look East policy. Why the sudden pivot? What was the actual operational goal on paper?
So in the early 1990s, India was facing a massive paradigm shift. The Soviet Union had collapsed, which meant India lost a major strategic and economic anchor overnight. Simultaneously, the center of global economic gravity was rapidly shifting toward the Asian tigers. So the specific original objectives of the Look East policy were intensely pragmatic.
It was about survival.
Pretty much. It was twofold profound economic integration and tight political cooperation with Southeast Asia and East Asia. India woke up and realized, if it didn't structurally align its economy with the booming markets to its east, it would just be left behind.
It wasn't just about sending diplomats to drink tea in Hanoi.
No, it was about integrating supply chains.
Which brings us to the modern era. Look East eventually evolved into what we now call the Act East policy. And if you picture a map, and you draw a line from New Delhi through the Bay of Bengal straight into the South China Sea, Vietnam sits right in the middle of that trajectory.
Geographically and strategically.
Exactly. Vietnam isn't just a participant in this policy, it is the linchpin. It's the designated country coordinator between India and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
But you cannot effectively act east without Vietnam acting as the bridge. They are the gateway into that broader ASEAN architecture.
Okay, so that's the background context. I want to shift gears to right now. Let's pull up an on-screen timeline of 2025 developments because we are looking at a cluster of trigger events this year that prompted this entire deep dive.
Yeah, the acceleration is real.
There is a massive acceleration happening as we speak. Fact 1, June 2025. India hosted the 13th political consultation and the 10th strategic dialogue with Vietnam.
And the agenda there was highly targeted.
Right. It wasn't generic pleasantries. They covered regional stability in the Indo-Pacific, economic and digital engagement, and cultural exchanges.
Exactly.
Then fact 2, the 2025 inauguration of the bilateral annual UN peacekeeping exercise, VINBAX. And this is a wild statistic to me. India is the only partner in the world conducting an annual field UN peacekeeping exercise with Vietnam.
Yeah, that exclusivity is incredibly telling.
Only partner.
Right. Militaries do not conduct joint field exercises annually unless there's a profound level of interoperability and trust. I mean, it requires sharing communications protocols, understanding each other's command structures, and literally physically deploying troops together.
It's a huge deal. And then there's fact 3. The translation of the 2024 to 2028 plan of action into concrete steps this year. Now, I have to push back here for a second because you and I both know how diplomacy works.
Oh, sure.
2 countries meet, they sign a beautiful leather-bound plan of action, everyone shakes hands for the cameras, and then absolutely nothing happens. It just sits in a drawer.
The graveyard of geopolitics.
Exactly. So what makes the 2025 translation of this specific 24 to 28 plan any different? Is it just the sheer volume of military and economic exchange finally pushing it from paper to practice?
That is precisely the differentiator.
Yeah.
You're right. The world is full of empty plans of action. But what makes this one fascinating is the actual transition from diplomatic rhetoric to operational funded reality.
Funded being the key word.
Yes. This plan is moving in 2025 because it is suddenly underpinned by hard financial mechanics and actual military commitments, which we'll detail in a minute. It's signaling true follow-through.
And why now, though?
Because of shared acute threat perceptions. Both nations have looked at the global board and realized they share a mutual urgent need for strategic diversification.
Okay, let's unpack that term, strategic diversification. Let's put up a stakeholder diagram showing Vietnam in the center, with branches going out to the US, Russia, China, and India, because Vietnam is playing a fascinating game right now.
It's the ultimate multi-vector balancing act.
Right. They are standing in the middle, managing relationships with all these heavyweights at once. Let's look at the Russia dynamic first. Historically, this was their strongest pillar, right? But now it feels like a serious downslide. What is the timeline there?
So, Russia is historically deeply significant for Vietnam, but currently it's highly problematic. The formal strategic partnership between Russia and Vietnam was established in 2001, and then it upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2012.
Okay, 2001 and 2012.
Right. For decades, Russia has been the absolute primary source of weapons, fighter jets, and naval equipment for the Vietnam People's Army.
But the data shows they are pulling away from Moscow. Why? I mean, what is the root cause of this deterioration? It can't just be politics?
It rarely is just politics. It really comes down to utility, economics, and reliability.
Okay.
There is a growing hard-nosed calculation in Hanoi right now that Russian weapon systems are becoming way overpriced relative to their actual capabilities on the battlefield.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, there's been a severe lack of technology transfer. Russia wants to sell the hardware, but they don't want to teach Vietnam how to build it themselves.
They want to keep them dependent.
Exactly. Combine that with increasingly poor maintenance contracts, which is obviously exacerbated by Russia's own supply chain constraints due to the Ukraine conflict, and you have a severe crisis.
Yeah, if you're a frontline state like Vietnam facing daily territorial pressures in the South China Sea, you simply cannot afford supply chain vulnerabilities.
You can't. You can't have your primary fighter jets grounded because you're waiting on parts from a sanctioned supplier.
Right.
And this is the exact mechanism driving Vietnam to actively diversify its defense industry cooperation. They are actively looking toward nations like France, Israel, and, crucially, India.
Okay, so overpriced gear, poor maintenance, no tech transfer. That's the Russia downslide. So as Russia slides down the priority list, we see the United States on an upward trajectory.
Yes, a very steep one.
And the dates here are rich with historical irony. 2025 marks exactly 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War.
Right.
It also marks 30 years since the normalization of U.S.-Vietnam diplomatic relations.
It is genuinely one of the most stunning geopolitical pivots of the last half-century. I mean, if you look at the bigger picture, ties reached a historic, almost unimaginable zenith in September 2023.
When Biden visited.
Exactly. President Joe Biden traveled to Hanoi, and alongside the late Communist Party of Vietnam General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong, they elevated the relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership.
And in the meticulous hierarchy of Vietnam's diplomatic canon, that is the highest possible tier.
The absolute highest.
And we see the proof of that elevation in the defense expansion. The U.S. completely lifted its historical arms embargo on Vietnam. We are now seeing active, real-world cooperation in maritime security, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief HADR, and peacekeeping operations.
Yes.
So Russia is fading as a reliable supplier. The U.S. is stepping up, but obviously carries massive historical baggage. Which brings us to the elephant in the room, the most complex neighbor, China.
Right. China is the primary geopolitical driver of almost everything Vietnam does. Vietnam's relations with China have experienced these intense ideological highs and really terrifying lows over the centuries.
Sure.
But the critical period that defines their modern posture, the thing you need to remember for your exams, is the severe deterioration that occurred between 2012 and 2016.
What caused that specifically?
This was driven primarily by conflicting territorial claims in the South China Sea and intense friction over Vietnam's attempts to conduct oil exploration within its own legally recognized exclusive economic zones.
I look at Vietnam and China, and I see two nations that share a border, a political ideology, deep economic ties. You would think they'd figure this out bilaterally behind closed doors. But China essentially wants to isolate Vietnam in these negotiations, right?
Yes.
And Vietnam is essentially throwing its hands up and pointing to international law. What is the core friction point here, conceptually?
It's a fundamental clash of diplomatic methodology. China strictly seeks a bilaterally negotiated solution. Why? Because in a one-on-one negotiation, China's asymmetric size, its military bulk, and its economic weight give it overwhelming leverage.
They can bully them.
They can absolutely bully. Vietnam, conversely, understands this trap perfectly.
Yeah.
Therefore, Hanoi emphasizes the settlement of the dispute strictly in accordance with international law.
Specifically UNCLS, right?
Yes. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Vietnam wants multilateral rule-based arbitration because international law levels the playing field against a giant.
Okay, let's connect all these dots on our stakeholder diagram because this is where the genius of the India-Vietnam relationship really reveals itself.
Go for it.
If Russia is no longer a reliable hardware supplier and the U.S. is offering help but might not be a palatable long-term anchor given the history,
Right.
and China is an active daily source of maritime friction, then Vietnam is essentially shopping for a reliable, capable, non-hegemonic partner. Is this the exact strategic vacuum that India was perfectly positioned to step into?
Precisely. You've just identified the core geopolitical mechanism at play here. Vietnam needs a partner with significant, proven military capability. They need someone with a shared threat perception regarding Beijing.
Right.
And crucially, they need a nation that harbors no hegemonic ambitions of its own in Southeast Asia.
Which is India.
Exactly. India perfectly fits that profile. India doesn't want to conquer Southeast Asia. It just wants a stable, multipolar balance. This leads us directly to the strategic motivations converging in the Indo-Pacific theater.
Let's pull up a strategic map of the South China Sea right now, because the geography here is strategy. If you visualize this region, both India and Vietnam share a remarkably similar threat perception.
They really do. Both New Delhi and Hanoi share a history of strained relationships, border wars, and active ongoing territorial disputes with China.
It's a shared trauma, almost.
It is. Because of this, they have synergized their efforts to resist what both capitals view as the assertive and aggressive behavior of Beijing.
And the strategic terms they use together are very specific. For answer writing, you need to reinforce these keywords. You will constantly hear three terms in their joint statements: rule-based international order, freedom of seas, and opposition to the 9-dash line.
Right, those are the big three.
Both India and Vietnam are aggressively opposing the militarization of the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. But let's focus on that 9-dash line claim.
Yes, for those unfamiliar, the 9-dash line is essentially a boundary that China draws on its own maps, claiming historical sovereignty over nearly the entirety of the South China Sea.
Which is wild.
It is. It's a claim that intersects directly with the exclusive economic zones of Vietnam, the Philippines, and others. It has been completely invalidated by international tribunals, but China enforces it militarily anyway.
And Vietnam, because of its long coastline, is essentially the frontline country pushing back against this Chinese expansionism.
Exactly. They are the buffer.
Which means, by partnering with Vietnam, India gets an opportunity to limit Chinese influence in India's own neighborhood, the Indian Ocean, by forcing Beijing to expend energy and focus in its own backyard, the South China Sea.
It is classical geopolitical balancing.
Let's bring this back to that incredible naval chessboard scenario I mentioned at the start of the deep dive. Vietnam is offering India berthing and docking rights in Nha Trang port.
Right. If you look at the map, Nha Trang is on the southeastern coast of Vietnam. Now, look just slightly north, across the water to Hainan Island. That is where China operates its new naval base at Sanya.
Yes?
Sanya is where they house their nuclear ballistic missile submarines. Nha Trang is situated strategically just south of Sanya.
And that geographical proximity is absolutely not a coincidence.
No way.
It is a highly calculated strategic posture by Hanoi. By granting the Indian Navy access to Nha Trang, Vietnam is facilitating an Indian naval presence mere miles from one of China's most sensitive, critical military installations.
Think about it. If the South China Sea is a chessboard, China has been advancing its pawns for a decade by building artificial islands and militarizing reefs. India gaining logistical access to Nha Trang isn't just a pawn move, it's like placing a knight directly behind China's defensive line.
That's a great analogy.
It complicates every single move Beijing tries to make. It forces China's Southern Theater Command to constantly monitor an Indian presence right on their doorstep. It creates a permanent strategic headache for Beijing, which is exactly what both India and Vietnam want. But, it's not just about naval ports and hard power.
Right.
This partnership is also deeply embedded in diplomatic architecture and international institutions. For example, Vietnam explicitly understands India's broader security concerns and is a vocal supporter of India's quest for permanent membership of the UN Security Council.
And Vietnam's own diplomatic weight is nothing to scoff at. They're deeply integrated into the regional organizations. We are talking about ASEAN, APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and the EAS, the East Asian Summit.
They are very influential.
Their influence within ASEAN has expanded significantly. And for India, this is critical. If India wants its Act East policy to actually succeed, Vietnam's integration and support here is an absolute prerequisite.
Yeah, we're seeing a deliberate alignment of grand policy frameworks. On one side, you have India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, the IPOI.
The IPOI, right.
And on the other side, you have ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The strategic goal of both New Delhi and Hanoi is to weave these two frameworks together to achieve shared security and prosperity.
They're building a diplomatic safety net across multiple fora. We should also briefly mention their joint efforts in the Mekong-Ganga Cooperation and the Asia-Europe meeting, or ASEM.
Definitely.
Okay, so the military logic is sound, the institutional and legal dimensions are in place, but as we know, a strategic partnership is totally hollow if there isn't actual cash flowing between the two countries.
Security alliances usually follow economic integration.
Exactly. So what are the economic implications? Let's pull up a data dashboard comparing the FY 23-24 and 2024 calendar year trade stats. Let's do a data drill down for memory retention.
The numbers are staggering when you consider where they started.
Okay, here we go. Financial year, April 2023 to March 2024. Total bilateral trade was $14.82 billion US dollars.
$14.82 billion.
Yep. India exported $5.47 billion and imported $9.35 billion. But look at the calendar year 2024. Total trade jumped to approximately $15.76 billion US dollars.
That is a massive leap.
$15.76 billion? India exports $5.43 billion, and Vietnam exports $10.33 billion. India is now solidly a top 10 trading partner for Vietnam.
And it's vital to understand the composition of that trade, right? It's not just basic commodities anymore. Vietnam continues to be an extremely attractive investment destination for heavy Indian capital.
What sectors are we talking about?
We're seeing massive Indian corporate investment in critical sectors. Oil and gas exploration is huge, notably ONGC Videsh operating in Vietnamese waters.
Yeah.
Then there's mineral processing, sugar manufacturing, agrochemicals, IT infrastructure, and agriculture processing.
So it's deep industrial engagement. But it's also about capacity building at the grassroots level, right?
Absolutely.
India relies heavily on what are called quick impact projects, or QIPs. These are small, fast, highly visible development projects. We're seeing this in water resource management in Vietnam's highly strategic Mekong Delta region, alignments on global sustainable development goals, and digital connectivity.
But perhaps the most ambitious economic connector is actually land-based. There is a massive focus right now on the operationalization of the AH-1, the Asia Highway 1.
All right, imagine driving from Istanbul all the way to Tokyo. That is the AH-1.
Exactly. And the significance of this highway cannot be overstated. When it's fully operational and integrated, it has the potential to drastically improve physical land connectivity between India and Vietnam, running right through Myanmar and Thailand.
It effectively connects the entire Indochina region with India's northeast.
Yes, this land bridge is a structural requirement for the overall prosperity of the region. And crucially, it reduces reliance on vulnerable maritime choke points.
So the money is flowing, the roads are being built. Now let's escalate this to the sharp end of the spear. Security implications, India's response, and the balancing strategy.
This is where it gets really serious.
Let's visualize an institutional relationship map and an escalation ladder for military ties here. We have to start with the landmark 2022 Defense Minister visit. This marked 50 years of diplomatic relations, and the major outcome was the signing of the Joint Vision Statement on India-Vietnam Defense Partnership towards 2030.
That Joint Vision 2030 is the architectural blueprint for everything happening today. It laid out exactly how the two militaries would integrate. But, as we discussed earlier, vision requires funding.
Right.
That brings us to the financial mechanics of that 2022 visit. The two ministers agreed on the finalization of a $500 million defense line of credit extended by India to Vietnam.
Okay, I want to pause and break that down for a second, because a line of credit sounds like a credit card, but in statecraft, it's actually a brilliant strategic tool. How does this specific $500 million mechanism further India's own Make in India, make for the world's vision, while simultaneously boosting Vietnam's capabilities? Like, who is actually paying whom here?
It's a very elegant piece of economic statecraft. A line of credit means the Indian government is providing $500 million in capital to Vietnam, but with a massive catch.
Okay.
That capital must be used to procure defense equipment manufactured in India.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So what happens? It immediately injects $500 million into India's own domestic defense manufacturing sector. That is the Make in India component. It creates jobs. It scales up Indian factories.
Right.
Then that newly minted hardware is exported to a strategic partner. That's the Make for the World component.
That is incredibly smart.
Ultimately, India upgrades Vietnam's military capacity to counter shared threats like China, using Indian industrial output, financed by Indian capital, that essentially stays within the Indian economy.
So it's basically a massive subsidy for India's own defense industry, brilliantly dressed up as foreign security assistance.
Exactly. It's a dual-use strategic tool that benefits both economies and both militaries.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Now let's look at another monumental development from that same 2022 visit, the Mutual Logistics Support MOU. We touched on this with the non-Trancord example, but let's define the concept clearly. Imagine an Indian destroyer patrolling the South China Sea for a month. What does a logistics agreement actually do for the crew on that ship?
Well, without a logistics agreement, if that Indian naval ship is running low on fuel, or needs food, or requires basic maintenance, they can't just pull into a Vietnamese port.
Right.
It requires a complex, ad hoc, highly bureaucratic diplomatic clearance process that can take days or even weeks.
Which you don't have time for in a crisis.
Exactly. A mutual logistics support agreement acts as a pre-approved administrative framework. It provides mutually agreed-upon terms for access to military facilities, the exchange of fuel, and the restocking of provisions.
So they just pull up?
Pretty much. The ship pulls in, presents the equivalent of a military fleet card, refuels, and gets back on patrol. It drastically increases the operational turnaround, endurance, and reach of the Indian military when operating far from home shores.
And the most vital takeaway here for exam recall, this was Vietnam's first such major agreement with any country in the world.
The very first one.
Out of all the powers courting them, Vietnam chose India for its first Mutual Logistics Support MOU. And if you interconnect this visually to India's network of logistics agreements, Vietnam becomes a critical node. India now has these agreements with all the Quad countries, the U.S., Japan, Australia, with France, Singapore, South Korea.
Right, starting with the pivotal MOA agreement signed with the U.S. back in 2016.
Exactly. Vietnam is now plugged into that matrix.
Which brings us to the actual hardware that Vietnam is buying.
Yeah.
The most significant headline-grabbing development is the approximately $700 million deal being finalized in 2025 for the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile system.
$700 million for BrahMos. Let's talk about why this missile terrifies adversaries. This isn't just a regular explosive.
No, it's not.
It flies at Mach 3, practically skimming the ocean surface, making it incredibly difficult for naval defense systems to intercept. Placing a shore-based battery of BrahMos missiles on Vietnam's coast effectively creates an anti-accessoria denial bubble in the South China Sea.
It absolutely does.
That is a massive deterrent capability being transferred from India to Vietnam.
It fundamentally alters the tactical calculus of any hostile navy operating in those waters. Furthermore, Vietnam has shown active interest in purchasing India's Akash surface-to-air missile systems and Dhruv advanced light helicopters.
It's a huge capacity boost.
But, it's crucial to remember that military ties aren't just about buying metal and explosives. They're inherently personnel-driven.
The hardware is useless without the human software.
Exactly. The Indian Army has a long-established history of training Vietnamese officers in UN peacekeeping and jungle warfare. Crucially, the Indian Navy has been instrumental in training personnel for Vietnam's emerging submarine forces.
We also see this playing out in direct gifts and grants. India has gifted 2 specialized simulators and provided a substantial monetary grant to set up a language and IT lab at the Air Force Officers Training School for the Vietnamese Armed Forces.
Yeah, building that foundational capacity.
And you see the camaraderie in naval diplomacy, too. Back in 2020, during the height of natural disasters, the Indian naval ship INS Kiltan made a high-profile visit to Ho Chi Minh City under Mission Sagar III to deliver flood relief materials.
Right.
That was immediately followed by a joint PASEX exercise with the Vietnam People's Navy. And looking ahead, they are moving beyond traditional sea and land domains. Defense cooperation now includes high-level dialogues on emerging domains like cybersecurity, search and rescue SAR, and joint defense R&D.
If we synthesize all of this, the history, the economics, the logistics, the missiles, we arrive at the future implications of this relationship.
Okay, let's summarize the strategy.
Vietnam's choice to aggressively deepen relations with India represents a highly calculated, masterful move. It is the very definition of strategic diversification.
Avoiding overdependence.
Exactly. Vietnam is actively, methodically avoiding overdependence on China or any single superpower. Simultaneously, India is cementing its role not just as a trading partner, but as a key security provider in the Indo-Pacific region.
And economically, the shift is just as profound. We're watching a transition from mere commodity trade to deeper industrial technology collaboration.
It's maturing.
All right, let's shift to our exam answer framework. I'm going to verbally construct a 250-word answer structure on the screen for you to visualize.
This is critical for revision.
Okay, introductory flow. Start with the Act East policy and the 2023-2025 elevation of strategic partnerships.
Good.
Body paragraphs. Break it down into 3 parts. 1, strategic and geopolitical mention the China factor, the South China Sea, and the 9-dash line. 2, defense cooperation hit the Joint Vision 2030, the $500 million line of credit, BrahMos, and the logistics milieu.
Don't forget the economics.
Right. 3, economic integration site, the $15.76 billion trade figure, the Mekong Delta QIPs, and the AH-1 highway. Finally, the conclusion. Summarize the shift toward multipolar strategic autonomy and maintaining a rule-based Indo-Pacific. Highlight your keywords to memorize. IPOI, VINBAX, strategic diversification.
That's a perfect structure.
Now, for the rapid revision recap, I'm going to quickly fire off the most critical data points for memory reinforcement. The $500 million credit line, the Nha Trang versus Sanya port dynamic, the 2012 to 2016 China-Vietnam deterioration, and the 2025 VINBAX exercise.
Got it.
Now, active recall prompts. I'm addressing you, the listener, directly. Without looking at your notes, can you name the naval base China operates just north of Vietnam's Nha Trang port?
Think about the submarines.
What year did the U.S. and Vietnam elevate their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership? And which major highway project aims to link India to the Indo-China region?
Lock those answers in.
All right, let's do a final revision capsule. Synthesize this for us one last time.
Sure. Think of it as a chain reaction. Geopolitics creates the necessity both nations face a shared hegemon. This political alignment secures the economic sphere, pushing trade to nearly $16 billion. That economic capital funds a security apparatus operationalized through the $500 million line of credit and the BrahMos transfer. And finally, this creates a massive domestic impact for India. Defense exports under Make in India are directly impacting multipolar stability in Southeast Asia. It is a perfect self-sustaining loop.
It really is a fascinating model of modern statecraft. You are now armed with the analytical clarity needed to completely master this topic. But before we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a deeper strategic question to mull over on your own.
A provocative thought.
Yes, we've seen Vietnam successfully navigate partnerships with former adversaries like the U.S., traditional allies like Russia, and rising powers like India, all while managing a highly complex border with China. As global supply chains continue to decouple, ask yourself, could Vietnam's model of hyper-pragmatic multi-alignment become the ultimate blueprint for middle powers in the 21st century?
Or will the sheer gravitational pull of superpower rivalry eventually force them to pick a definitive side? It's a question that will define the next decade. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.